have a worldwide will, that same will has to be used to govern all of your assets, no matter where it is.
Yeah.
What happens then is, in order to apply for your probate in the UK, for instance, in this case scenario, you would have to get your will. You have to apply for your letter of executorship in South Africa. As we know, that takes about 3 months, sometimes less, sometimes more. But that's the minimum amount of, that's your waiting period.
And that's normally done by a professional.
That's normally done by a professional, or whomever is appointed in your will as an executor. In recent cases, the Master of the High Court will always ask, if you've appointed a spouse or a family member, they'll ask that family member, do you have a professional body that is helping you wind up your estate? If not, you need to appoint someone to...
If you like this episode, guys, please give us a like. It really helps the channel. Thumbs up, hit the bell icon, leave a comment, and... Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome back to the Campus Dialogues, a Muslim Views production in affiliation with MuslimFin Family Office. MuslimFin Family Office, building trust, preserving wealth, empowering generations. I'm your host, Ali Salie, and this evening we have another exciting episode for you. Tonight we're talking to the specialist, the fiduciary specialist, and we're talking local estates versus offshore estates.
Wow.
I mean, this is a topic of note. This is something that people want to know.
Correct.
This is something that people want
That's
to
important.
hear. So here to introduce our guest, who is no stranger to the podcast, my good friend and colleague, Shiraaj Buziek. Shiraaj.
Assalamu alaikum, Ali.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. How are you?
Alhamdulillah. Always good to be in the office. How are you doing?
Alhamdulillah.
Like I said, we're shifting gears tonight from markets to something even more personal, estate planning. Especially when, your assets span borders. So like, from a flat in London to a bank account in Dubai, and tonight we're joined by, it's more of a welcome back. We've had the guest on our show, Safira Kaji, a fiduciary specialist. Welcome back to the Muslim Dialogue podcast.
Wa alaikum salam, Shiraaj and Ali. It's nice to be back. Thank you for having me again.
Safira, it's always good to have you. I'm quite excited to have you back. We had a wonderful discussion the last time you were here. But on tonight's topic, with many families in our community, having roots or investments abroad, understanding the difference between local South African estate and an offshore estate, it's no longer a luxury, it's a necessity. So I want to start at home, and for many, the concept of an estate can feel abstract, something distant or reserved, for the wealthy. But it's not, it's about what happens to your assets when you're no longer here. So can you briefly break down, what constitutes a local estate here in South Africa, compared to an offshore estate?
So to start off with, you say an estate is for the wealthy. An estate is anything you own, whether it be a piece of furniture, a jewelry item, bank accounts, properties, investments, that's your estate. Anything that you have purchased in your name becomes part of your estate. When we look at foreign estates versus local estates, you have to look at the jurisdiction of the asset. So where is the asset being held? What is the status of the asset, meaning which law governs that asset? Where is it being maintained? If it's an investment, where's the investment being maintained? Who is administering that investment for you? And is it in South Africa or is it in a different jurisdiction? When you look at those types of things, you need to look at whether it's a property in another country, whether it's an investment, a bank account, anything that you hold anywhere outside of South Africa attracts various items to your estate, right? It becomes a massive issue for your executor if your will and your estate plan is not drafted or not taken care of. The reason being is if you have one will that says everything should go according to South African law, it encompasses everything in one estate and it becomes cumbersome for the executor itself. Whereas if you have to now go and deal with your assets offshore, you have to get probate offshore, you have to get a letter of executorship, which is probate, in whichever region this asset is based. You mentioned a property in London. You'd have to apply to the UK people for a probate. And when you have to do that, you have to use your South African will, and that takes time. That delays your offshore estate. Whereas if you have the correct plans in place and the correct discussions with the correct people, you can then do a local will that governs your assets only in South Africa, and an offshore will that governs your assets anywhere else in the world. And then your two estates can run concurrently. One doesn't rely on the other two to balance each other out. You know, they can work concurrently and be wound up at the same time.
Okay. Safira, you used the word probate.
Yes.
Just for our audience, maybe you could explain the concept of probate and then, you know, applying for a probate offshore, for example. Okay, so let's start maybe with that, and then I'll have a follow-up question.
Not a problem. When you talk about probate, Ali, we talk about applying for the power to wind up your estate. So like in South Africa, you have a letter of executorship. The Master of the High Court gives you authority to manage someone's estate, wind up the estate and transfer it over to the beneficiaries in terms of the will, in terms of South African law of succession, whichever may happen, you know, whether there's a will or no will. When you talk about probate, it talks about the type of letter of executorship in each different region. So each country calls it something else. In the UK, it's called a probate. In majority of your countries abroad, it is called a letter of probate. This gives your attorney, conveyancer, whomever is going to do your estate in that jurisdiction, the authority to wind up your estate. Okay. Without that document, they're not allowed to take hold of your assets, close bank accounts, transfer it to your heirs according to your wishes.
Okay. So let me just understand now. If you have a South African will in place, but you have assets offshore, and you use your South African will and you add your offshore assets into the South African will, stating that that South African will is now sufficient to cover your worldwide assets, right? What is the process in the event of death of wrapping up that estate? So my question is, does that will then have to be, let's say you have assets in the UK. You've been talking about the UK. So now you have a property in London, you have some bank accounts in London, you have some investments sitting there. And does that will now have to be mailed to that jurisdiction and then run, you know, through kind of the court system, okay, be wrapped up and then come back to South Africa, and this is my understanding of it, and then come back to South Africa, and then the process starts here in South Africa, versus what you were saying, where if you have a will in South Africa and then an offshore will, and then they could simultaneously be, you know, kind of submitted through to the court so that you can wrap up the estate. Is that understanding correct?
Almost correct. So when you have a worldwide will, that same will has to be used to govern all of your assets, no matter where it is. Yeah. What happens then is, in order to apply for your probate in the UK, for instance, in this case scenario, you would have to get your will. You have to apply for your letter of executorship in South Africa. As we know, that takes about 3 months, sometimes less, sometimes more. But that's the minimum amount of, you know, that's your waiting period.
And that's normally done by a professional?
That's normally done by a professional, or whomever is appointed in your will as an executor. In recent cases, the Master of the High Court will always ask, if you've appointed a spouse or a family member, they'll ask that family member, do you have a professional body that is helping you wind up your estate? If not, you need to appoint someone to help you wind up the estate because of the cumbersome tasks that need to happen in an estate. Now, what happens when you have offshore assets? That letter of executorship, along with that will, needs to become a sealed document. So there's a certain seal that gets put onto that will and onto that letter of executorship, and it gets sent over. The original copies have to get sent over to the UK. And
is that via South African mail?
By South African mail. Well, we tend to use courier services, right? You know, so it gets couriered to an individual. So again, in the UK, it's not always easy to just appoint a lay person, a family member, or whoever you've chosen. You know, you're always going to need a professional body there to wind up an estate. You can't just appoint anybody in the UK as an executor. So that original will and that original letter of executorship that is sealed needs to be sent to the UK. They then take that and apply for probate. So it then becomes the executor then gets appointed based off your South African will and South African estate. And then the estate can kind of run concurrently.
And how long does that process take approximately now, if we were to, because you already said 3 months initially, so we're already 3 months in. And
how
now
long
we're
is a
mailing-
piece of string? It's difficult to say, with the Master of the High Court and all the difficulties that they've been facing over the last couple of years. It can take, sometimes it's 2 weeks, sometimes it's longer, depending on what backlogs they're facing, depending on the circumstances at that point in time. So it does delay the estate a little bit further. And whilst I say that the two estates with offshore and local can run concurrently, when it's worldwide, your liquidation and distribution account becomes more complex, meaning that all of your assets gets included in your liquidation and distribution account for both executor's fees and estate duty purposes. So your whole estate gets included up front. Whereas if the two are running concurrently separately, the only thing that gets included is your offshore assets for estate duty purposes, and you use your double taxation, your rebates that you can utilize for any double taxations that is available if it's in a jurisdiction that has a double taxation treaty available. Then you do get your discounts. But if not, then you've got one liquidation distribution account that has your maximum executive fees, that has your maximum estate duty. It affects everything that gets wound up in the long run. You're looking at trying to save costs. You're looking at trying to save time. Because without that, you're sitting in that's when estates start taking 2 years, 3 years to be wound up because of all of the backlogs.
So, Safira, essentially what you're saying is if I had assets in different countries, it would be in my best interest to literally have a will for each of those jurisdictions to cover those assets.
I would say yes and no.
Okay.
Yes, meaning that if you have assets, say for instance in Dubai or the Middle East, Saudi, it gets tricky for us as individuals because certain countries have things called forced heirship. Like in Saudi, they follow Sharia law. So no matter what you say, it's going to go in terms of Sharia law because they are a Muslim-run country.
That's interesting. Yeah.
So whatever you say, if you are a Muslim, your estate has to go in terms of Sharia law. Whereas if you anywhere else in the world, say for instance France, Belgium, certain other countries have forced heirship, meaning that it's not going to go in terms of your will. It's not going to go in terms of your wishes. It's going to go in terms of their interstate succession. It goes according to the way they need your estate to be wound up. And certain countries allow for domicile of choice. It gets very technical and it gets very difficult for you to just do a broad discussion on it. You have to have these discussions with a specialist so that the specialist can tell you, look, you need to consult with X, Y, and Z in order to make sure all of your estates are being wound up and all of your documents speak to one another. So if you have a local will versus an offshore will, it has to say more or less the same thing. Because now if you have a local will and it says, your first clause in every will says, I hereby revoke all previous wills made by me. And then you have an offshore will that says, I revoke all previous wills made by me. But both of them are talking to your worldwide estate. So which will then supersedes the other? So each one needs to be talking the same language, referring to my local estate, my estate in South Africa, my estate in the rest of the world, my estate in London, wherever your assets are situated.
Wow, that is amazing. That's blown my mind actually. You mentioned something about tax, and I want to touch on that from a tax perspective. What are the key things that kick in upon death? Like estate duty, that people need to be aware of.
So it depends on the jurisdiction you have your assets in. If we're going to go back to the UK, it seems to be a common topic tonight. If you go to the UK, you have certain discounts. You have certain, like in South Africa, you have your first 3.5 million that doesn't attract estate duty. In the UK, you have that minimum amount as well that does not attract estate duty, that does not attract inheritance tax in the UK. Anything above that amount, there's going to be inheritance tax. And then you need to look at, is there a double taxation treaty? Are we going to get anything recognized when you do your South African estate? And then you apply whatever. So what happens is, hypothetically, you have a property that is worth £500,000, right? You get your abatement, and then anything above that, you've got to pay your inheritance tax. Inheritance tax in the UK is higher than in South Africa. So you do get recognition for the amount that is paid there, but obviously only to the amount that was paid in South Africa. So if it was only 20% in South Africa and 40% in the UK, you can only deduct 20% from your South African estate duty. Those are kind of things you need to look at, look at where you can win, where you can structure your estate better to try and minimize your inheritance taxes that comes across anywhere in the world. Each and every single country has their own rule around inheritance tax.
And then also, Safira, there's things like situs tax, death tax. And I think a lot of times many of our viewers might not even know that these types of taxes actually exist. So you have a lot of guys that, for example, are sitting on, the Easy Equities app.
Yeah.
Potentially. And they potentially investing some of their funds in USD, converting some of their money, investing it offshore into companies.
Yeah.
Now that money's sitting, $100,000 potentially, $200,000 potentially, but they don't realize that those funds, even though they're working it on their phone, is actually sitting in a different jurisdiction.
Correct.
And based on that, they actually require an offshore will. Or they could be dealing with something like situs tax, where if the amount is over, look, this is not a certainty, but if the amount is over a certain dollar value, then the US government can say, well, we are actually you're going to have to pay a death tax on that. And so by not having a will in place or certain structures in place and really planning correctly, you could be doing you just think, I'm making money, but you're actually leaving your family in a worse off position in many cases without you even realizing. So I just wanted to, bring that up. But what I also wanted to mention, Safira, is the Sharia compliancy of these wills, right?
Yeah.
So now we're sitting in, with, let's go back to the US example. South Africa, not a Muslim country. The US, not a Muslim country like Saudi, for example.
Yeah.
We are Muslims and we want to have our estate distributed in the form in Sharia. But there are also all of these other technicalities that we need to consider. What are some of the things that Muslim viewers need to be aware of?
So again, Ali, it's difficult to just say off the top of my head what are the difficulties that they would follow, that they would face. It's always going to be important. The minute you have assets anywhere outside of South Africa, the minute you have any form of asset, it's important to consult with someone, to look at your estate, to plan your estate accordingly, because the US, the UK, there's a lot of countries that have freedom of gestation, meaning that you can draft a will and you can put anything you want in your will, provided that it's legal and enforceable. So for instance, in the US, if you have a local will, South African will, and a will that governs your assets in the US, you can still have your will say that it's got to go in terms of Sharia law. These are the heirs that needs to benefit from your estate. Whereas if you go to a country that has forced heirship, you may not get what you're looking for. Your estate may not go in terms of Sharia law. It would go in terms of the law of that country. And that's where you now need to look at, do I really want assets in that country if I cannot distribute it as per my own wishes? If I cannot let it go in terms of Sharia law. Alternatively, you need to look at, can I put it in a structure that's going to protect it and it can still go in terms of Sharia law? There's a lot of things we need to look at when it comes to your local estate versus your offshore estate. And that's why it becomes important. Like I said to you in the previous podcast, that we have to get to know our people back to front, know where every single cent is spent and where every single cent is invested, so that we can make sure we have the correct plan in place that covers everything for them.
Yeah, I think that's the key, and it might sound daunting, but proper planning is a solution.
Yes.
And you've mentioned, separate wills for offshore assets, but when do structures like international trust become a useful tool?
It would be a useful tool, like if you have assets that's going to start attracting estate duty. Like Ali mentioned, in the US, you get your certain USD value that you get as tax-free. Anything above that, you pay inheritance tax, CETA tax. In the US and the UK, it's called inheritance tax. You would then, you can take that assets, like in South Africa, if you could have the correct structures in place, you can have offshore trusts set up for those structures. It gets a little more technical when it comes to the US and offshore trusts. It's not always advisable, but again, it's something that you need to look at and something you need to sit down with a professional and ask them, I have these assets. What structure can I use to protect these assets? Because each jurisdiction has different laws. Some recognize trusts, some don't recognize trusts. Some recognize companies, some don't recognize foreign companies, foreign trusts. You need to look at the legislation in the land and what is going to be best suitable for your assets in that country.
I always find it interesting when an estate plan is drafted and the clients see this estate plan and then they realize, oh, okay, now I actually see it in black and white, and I'm seeing the numbers and it's all making sense to me, and I see what I'm worth. And then they look at things from a liquidity perspective and they say, oh my goodness, especially like our Muslim clients, for example, who love property. Now they start looking at the liquidity and they say, hey, well, what this means is that, I'm going to have to sell a property here, or I'm going to sell a few properties here for me to just be able to, pay the taxes. Is that something that you come across, Safira?
I'd say yes, Ali. I'd say in not just in our Muslim community, I'd say across South Africa in general, everybody's striving to build the estate. And yes, it's great to have estates that have all of these assets, and we call it asset-rich estates, but liquidity-poor estates. And without the proper planning, that liquidity is going to eat into your asset-rich estate. And that's not what you want in the long run. You don't want your heirs or your beneficiaries to come and say, but I had to sell my house to pay taxes. I had to sell my dad's heirlooms to be able to cover the taxes. It becomes a touchy subject, and that's again where family feuds start happening. Like, why do I have to sell these assets to pay taxes? It's important, again, when you look at your estate plan, to look at, okay, this is your possible liquidity shortfall. This is your possible solutions to that shortfall.
Like the car fall, for example. Yes.
It's important, to take note of these things. And again, failing to plan is planning to fail. If you don't have the proper plan in place, you're not going to get the right access for your heirs, for your beneficiaries. You have a minor child that you need to take care of, but you've got an asset-rich estate and a liquidity-poor estate. What's going to happen? The child's going to have lots of assets, but nothing to feed it. If it's properties all over the place, there's rental income, but there's expenses that goes off the rental income. What is the child going to use for maintenance, for school fees, for things that you take care of in your life? But when you're no longer there, who's taking care of that?
Yeah. Safira, you've been in the industry for quite some time. You've got quite a large experience dealing with estates. What's the single biggest mistake people make, with the offshore estates?
With the offshore estates? That's a difficult question.
Are they doing so many mistakes?
It's not necessarily so many mistakes. It comes down to people not understanding why they need an offshore wall. It comes down to simple understanding and helping your clients see the bigger picture. Where a lot of the times, the biggest thing that I see is that there's a worldwide wall, a South African worldwide wall. and that all the delays that comes with that, all the processes that you have to, the hurdles you have to face in order to get that. I mean, there's certain instances where you have a worldwide will and it's in a foreign country. You have to then get that will translated to that language, and that costs money. Then you have to get it sealed by the South African courts. Then you have to get all of that long winding items done and taken care of before you can actually get to the point of winding up your estate and transferring your assets to your beneficiaries. There's a lot to think about when winding up an estate, when planning for an estate.
So to follow up on that, how do South Africa's exchange control impact, the transfer of offshore assets to the ES?
You're asking very difficult questions tonight. When it comes to SARB, right, it goes down to a lot of different factors. Like, one, was the funds taken out correctly? Was it declared up front? There's certain applications that you can make to SARB to keep those funds offshore. There's certain applications that takes place, like, for instance, you are South African born, but you're inheriting from a family member that's never been a South African resident, that's never lived in South Africa. There's certain applications you can make to have certain assets excluded from your South African estate because the person you're inheriting from was never South African taxpayer. So therefore it's excluded. So it becomes really, really important, like I say, to look at the smallest item, anything, you need to look at the source of where that asset comes from. So you pass away, you inherited something from your uncle in Switzerland that's never been a South African citizen. It's now assets that you have that's offshore, that you apply to keep offshore. Now you've got to move it over to your heirs, to your children, to your spouse. Do you need to bring it back to South Africa? Can you keep it offshore? Is it included in a South African estate? Is it excluded? What are the questions? Where do you find the answers? It goes down to consulting with the correct people, putting the plans in place, and being honest. A lot of the times people want to hide assets away, like, if they don't know, if SARS doesn't know about it, I can keep it under the blanket, I can keep it under my mattress and SARS will never know. But like I said, death and taxes are the only thing in life that are inevitable, and SARS always catches you at some point. If it's not whilst you are alive, it's when you pass away. When your estate starts declaring everything, saying, there's income coming from this account here. Where's this money coming from? Have you declared it? Yes or no? You haven't declared it? Why not? Where does it come from? Please pay up all of the taxes that you should have paid all the years. They do look into it quite a lot, especially when you have estate duty in an estate. The audits on an estate become really cumbersome, and they look at every single thing. So again, without planning.
SARS wants the pound of flesh. Safira, for our clients, from a relatable perspective, we have, since 1994, we've had a lot of Muslim families that have actually immigrated to, let's say, the US, Australia, New Zealand.
Yeah.
In many cases, they still have pension funds here, or they have property here, or they have family here still, investments and those other types of assets, right? But they're living abroad now, and they've been abroad for many years. What are some of the... If there was one piece of advice that you would have for them, for the expats, what would that be?
Consult with your tax specialist.
Say that a little bit louder.
Consult with your tax specialist, because if you're living abroad and you have absolutely no intention of coming back, you need to look at things like, have you formally immigrated? Have you ceased to be a tax resident? When have you ceased to be a tax resident? Why have you ceased to be a tax resident? You need to look at everything, and you need to say, okay, yes, I've formally immigrated. Now, how does funds flow from, I've still got property here, I've still got investments here. What did I declare to SARB? Well, what have I been doing? So it's not an easy once-off answer. Like, you need to look at, again, ask all the questions that needs to be asked, One, am I a tax resident in South Africa? Yes or no? When did I stop being a tax resident in South Africa? Have I declared the correct stuff to SARB? Did I formally immigrate in terms of SARB, in terms of tax? You need to look at all of those questions. And only once you have all of those answers can you then come forward and say, okay, this needs to happen. You need to look at it from that perspective and plan for it. Again, planning. Now, coming back to that, if you are a beneficiary, say for instance, you've passed away and you've got a son that's living in Australia and he was never South African tax resident and he needs to inherit from your South African estate, they can't just pay him directly into his Australian bank account. It needs to be declared to SARB. It needs to have the correct channel of flowing from South Africa to him. Does he have a South African bank account? There's all of those questions you need to ask, like, who is going to benefit from my estate? Do they have the correct paperwork to receive the funds that they are inheriting? There's all of those questions you need to ask. And it comes down to looking at every single item, every single teeny tiny bit of information makes the plan better for you.
Safira, it's incredibly enlightening and frankly an essential conversation. But I wanted to touch on our previous podcast we had. One of the questions that came through, it was regarding the wealth and inheritance. And the individual asked, if I'm only married by religious rights, so I only had a Islamic ceremony, a nikah, how does that impact my will? And the follow-up question was, if I was married to my spouse only Islamically, and he married again, but he married his wife through, the courts, how does the country look at that?
Oh, that's complicated.
It was a question that popped out. And I thought, I'm going to ask you when you're back on the podcast. Now, are you ready for it?
I think you need to be giving me these questions beforehand. So when you look at stuff like that, because of the way legislation is changing, South African marriages are still in the process of being accepted. Okay. The bill is still being pushed back and forth. But in a nutshell, Muslim marriages are now recognized by South African law. It is there. It is getting the right recognition that it was. Okay. But in terms of a stance where you've got a South African marriage in terms of Islamic rights, and a legal marriage that you've gone to court for, because the court does not recognize polygamy, that marriage is recognized as the lawful spouse. Until you go back and you say, but wait, there is all of these different stuff. And it then becomes a bit tricky because the Marriages Act has not been finalized yet. It becomes a very tricky situation as to who gets recognized, why it gets recognized. So it will become a massive court battle to get a spouse then recognized. When it comes to various spouses, polygamy is not generally recognized in South Africa.
Safira, absolutely interesting topic, and again, we've run out of time. But for the audience, to let you know, we are going to have Safira back on for another episode. And next time we'll be talking about local trust and offshore trust. Is that right, Safira?
Correct.
Okay, wonderful. Looking forward to that. And we encourage the audience to please ask some questions. And those who are interested can also reach out to us here at MuslimFin Family Office. If you want your own estate plan, that is something that we can do for you. You can hear from Safira. It is very much an individual thing, and definitely something that you need to sit down with your professionals with, really, unpack your specific situation, speak to the experts and really get an understanding of what your estate looks like and where your assets are sitting. So such an important conversation tonight. If you like this episode, guys, please give us a like. It really helps the channel. Thumbs up, hit the bell icon, leave a comment, and assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.